51 now. Okay. So 1, 2, 3, start. Okay. Okay. Two left. Good evening. Okay. Good evening, Anjali ji. I think I will start now. We can begin. Hari Om, Rangaji. So, okay, everything is okay. So we'll start. Namaskar, everyone. A very good evening, and I'm extremely delighted and happy to be a part of this 47 series of the Think India lecture. And I'm more happy and privileged to actually be talking about someone as great, iconic, and patriotic as Swatantra Veer Vinayak Damodar Savarkar, and that too in the month of his birth, that is May. Thanks to technology, despite the lockdown, despite the physical distancing that we all have, we are able to connect with each other as though we are in the same room and talk about our past, about this great person today. So the title that we decided on, and thank you very much to Mrityunjay ji and Shivam ji for inviting me for this lecture. And the title that we discussed was Veer Savarkar, Myths and Facts. I think that title too is very, very appropriate because as all of you know, and there was one comment there which said, you know, what are the information to counter left liberals. Now, time and time again, you know, the kind of myths, the kind of allegations that are hurled against this man who died way back in 1966. You know, it's something that occupies prime time news debates, as all of you know. So every time there are elections, every time there is anything to do with contemporary politics, the issue always is taken back to Veer Savarkar. So you will have someone from the Congress, right from the great Mr. Rahul Gandhi to everybody else mocking Savarkar, calling him a Kair. You have a Rajasthan government which decides whether or not to have him in the syllabus, textbooks syllabus, whether to call him Veer or whether he was a Kair. Chhattisgarh government gives all kinds of, alibis that he was the one who propounded the two-nation theory. Many kind of such allegations which go on. There were, insinuations that he was behind Mahatma Gandhi's murder. So there are a host of, allegations that are there. Now, the saddest part is, for so many years, 60 years after he died nearly, there was hardly any intellectual discussion, and that's the saddest part, where even people who are his proponents, who are on his side, they probably did not read up so much, because the depth and the width and the depth of Savarkar's writings, whether be it his essays, be it his poetry, his the nataks that he wrote, the plays, and his whole philosophy, political and ideological philosophy, it's so vast. 10 huge volumes itself of the Savarkar Samagra Vangmay, which is there, almost 400-500 pages each. It's a lot to drink all that, digest all that, understand the man, and then speak on his behalf or speak for him. So even that's the saddest tragedy I feel of this man, where even those who are on his side, they really did not know how to counter, and especially when you have the toxic allegations that are put by this intellectual gang, then you don't know how to counter that with cogent arguments. So we'll take up some of these issues, and I don't want to make it, we don't need to sound defensive that we are kind of being his lawyer. I don't think Savarkar needs any one of us as a lawyer. His work, his life speaks for itself. But then, as people who appreciate and support him and his role in our country's history, it's important to know history as it was, the facts as they were. So that's why this myth and fact becomes very important. So what was the first? We'll dive in straight into the discussion about what was the first myth that is normally hurled against him, and through him also to people in the RSS and so on. That is the usual one, that he did not even participate in the freedom struggle. Now this stems from that same mentality which we saw, the former leader of opposition in the Lok Sabha, Mallikarjun Kharge, who in a reply to Prime Minister Modi in the parliament, in a sacred place like the parliament, is is there are questions already. I'll just finish the whole thing, Om Prakash ji. I will certainly talk about all these allegations. First, we'll listen to this, and then if I have not answered anything, then we can take up one by one. So I'm starting with the first myth that is there, that he is not, they did not contribute. And as I said, Mallikarjun Kharge in parliament said something like, even the dogs in your houses did not, participate. आपके घरों के कुत्तों ने भी स्वतंत्रता संग्राम में कोई भाग नहीं लिया था. So this is that same mentality where everything of the freedom struggle is localized to one ideology, the non-violent struggle, or to the Congress party, or to almost say that we were the only ones who participated in the freedom struggle. Everyone else is an outsider, and so you are usurpers to the throne. We are the rightful successors to the throne in independent India. So because of that, this narrative has also come up in the last 73 years, where the contributions of all other players in the freedom struggle is almost removed from our history. So if you see, right from 1857, the first war of Indian independence, which incidentally just 10th of May, 3 days back, was the anniversary of the 1857 uprising. So from then on till the 1946 naval mutiny in Bombay, which was led by Subhash Chandra Bose and the Indian National Army, there was a continuous and almost a charged up, Sashastra Kranti, armed conflict also that was going on. And in that, the role of Savarkar becomes very, very important. And I'll describe how. So a little about his background. Savarkar was born on 28th of May, 1883 in the small village called Bhagur in Nashik in Maharashtra, in a Chitpavan Brahmin family. His parents were Damodar Pant Savarkar and Radhabai. He had an elder brother, Ganesh Damodar or Baba Rao as he was called, a younger brother, Dr. Narayan Rao, and a sister, Maina. Now, when he was very young, about 8 or 9 years, that's when he lost his mother, Radhabai, to cholera. And around that time, very coincidentally, just as what we are facing today with an epidemic, you had this epidemic in different parts of India and particularly Maharashtra, which was the plague. And incidentally, the Epidemic Act, which has been imposed in the country all over now, was enacted during that time, 1896 or so. So, under the provisions of this Epidemic Act, the British government took complete charge over the administration in the terms of not knowing how to deal with the health hazards and the issues. They would storm into people's houses, women would be molested, the puja ghars in houses would be raided, and the stigma that was attached to anybody or any family that was infected of plague was so immense that they would be ostracized or taken far away from the city and so on. So there was lot of dissent and discontent among people about this the repressive manner in which the British government handled the whole plague epidemic. So two brothers, the Chapekar brothers, they took up this whole cause of taking revenge against this, and they killed the plague commissioner in Pune, Walter Rand and Ayerst, and they were hanged after that. So there was outcry all over India about this, and particularly young Savarkar, who was about 12-13, he was so deeply influenced by all of this that in front of his Kuladevi, Ashtabhuja Bhavani, he takes a vow, Shatrus Marta Marta Mare to Zunzain. Till my last breath, I will keep fighting the enemy and kill them. He never said, I will die myself. He said, I will kill them. So this was taken as a childish vow, but little did even he know that he is going to live up to make this vow true. So a few years later, in fact, he loses his own father, Damodar Pant, to plague, and the family shifts to Nashik. And that is when the first ever, he actually makes his vow come true, where the first ever secret society of India is organized by Savarkar, which was called initially the Rashtra Bhakta Samuha, which later changes its name first to the Mitra Mela and then becomes the Abhinav Bharat. Now, what was the philosophy behind this? Now, when we think of Savarkar, we seldom associate him as a revolutionary, because revolutionary is always associated with Marxism and Marxist philosophy. But here was a man who actually was a revolutionary and inspired revolutionary thought in India, not inspired by Karl Marx or the Marxist lineage, but then by the Italian revolutionaries, Mazzini, Garibaldi and others, who did something very similar in Italy. The Young Italy movement that was there in Italy, where youngsters would get together, and the whole basic philosophy of these small secret groups was, how do we infiltrate the army? Because the army was composed, like in India also, the army was composed largely of Indians, the Indian soldiers. So if you can appeal to their patriotic sentiments and get them onto your side to defect after they have been trained in arms to revolt against the British, then in no time the empire can be desecrated. That was the whole idea behind this, which was drawing from 1857 model, and which eventually what happened in 1946 in the naval mutiny, and which is what actually got India our freedom, and not really, Quit India and other things, which were important movements of mass gathering, creating a national awareness. But then between 1942 and 47, there were 5 years gap. So what was it that caused India to get her freedom? We'll talk more about that later. So Savarkar started these small, groups in Nashik, in a small little room above a house, and slowly, as we saw, the whole, Abhinav Bharat literally started having more than 500 members from different parts of Maharashtra and also different parts of India. And they also started making connections with revolutionaries in other parts of India, like in Bengal, in the Anushilan Samiti and so on, and also Punjab. So it was almost like a pan-Indian caucus that was created, saying simultaneously, if there is a armed rebellion against the government, in the army particularly, and by other people, then we can overthrow the British. This was their understanding. And the whole intellect, the idea behind that was Savarkar's, considering right from childhood, he was a voracious reader. He had read world history almost by the time he was 10, and so he knew everything that was happening in different parts of the world. And so he tried to adopt a lot of that for the Indian struggle. Now, a few years later, 1902, he goes away to Fergusson College in Pune to do his BA, and there too, in different colleges in Pune, the Abhinav Bharat movement picks up. And what is again important, so the first thing that I mentioned was the first organized secret society in India which asked for complete independence from the British, was started by Savarkar. The second important aspect of this part of his life was the fact that he created the first ever student bonfire of foreign clothes. Now, usually when we talk about bonfire and Swadeshi, the idea that comes is of Gandhiji and the Congress. But actually, in 1905, to protest against the partition of Bengal by Lord Curzon, Savarkar gave this idea to start this student bonfire movement, which was approved by Tilak, who was his political guru, and that's how we had this in Pune. Now, there's a place in Pune which still commemorates this spot where people went and did the bonfire, the Holika Dahan of all these foreign clothes. And for this, he was also rusticated from college by the principal, and he was made to pay a heavy fine. So this was the kind of contribution and the kind of energy that he brought to the freedom movement at this time. And what is very important to note also is, the revolutionaries of this time, they spoke for total and complete freedom. Now, the Congress actually asked for Purna Swaraj way later in 1930, if you remember in your history textbooks. But 1905 itself, these revolutionaries, led by Savarkar and others, they were asking for total and complete independence, no concessions that were asked. Unlike the, what you have, the Naram Dal, Garam Dal, the nationalist extremists, whatever we have, the different moderates and extremists among the Congress, Gopal Gokhale on one side, Tilak on the other side, who also spoke about responsive, cooperation. Depending on how the British will react with us, we will respond with either cooperation or non-cooperation. Whereas the revolutionaries, they stood for total and complete freedom. Now the next phase in his life comes when on a student scholarship given by this amazing philanthropist in London, Shyamji Krishnavarma, Savarkar goes away to study law in London, and London then becomes the hotbed for the freedom movement of India. And you know, in Europe, a lot of revolutionary movements were going on to secure freedom for India. And the reason for that was the sedition laws in Europe were much more less stringent than what they were in India. So you could do propaganda against the government. You could bring out newsletters. So most of these people, they used to bring out newsletters urging for Indian freedom. Also take up the Indian cause in an international scenario. So with these revolutionaries in Ireland, in France, in Russia, in America. So they would all the time talking with all of them and highlighting the plight of British India. So that is what happened. And so even Shyamji Krishnavarma used to bring out this newsletter called Indian Sociologist. So there was this India House, which was a hostel that he had created, where on the face of it, he used to invite people who, young students who were good in studies, but also who had that nationalistic ambition in them to fight for India's freedom. And Tilak actually recommended Savarkar's case, and he gets this Shivaji scholarship to go to London to study there. And while he was there at the India House, that he becomes the leader of this whole movement, and a fascinating array of characters of our freedom struggle, whom sadly we don't even study about in our history textbooks, all start featuring at this time. Along with Shyamji Krishnavarma and Savarkar, you have Madam Bhikaji Kama, Lala Hardayal, who started the Gadar Party, Virendranath Chattopadhyay, Madan Lal Dhingra, VVS Iyer, MPT Acharya, Sardar Singh Rana, Sikandar Hayat Khan, numerous other such people who were there in London, in Paris, all over Europe, and fighting for India's cause. So what was Savarkar's contribution in the 5 stormy years that he spent in London? One was to create an intellectual corpus for the revolution. Now we think of revolution usually as some chutput, incidents where some, angry young men threw bombs, killed some people. It had no strategy, no thinking, nothing of that sort. But that was false. That is a kind of a construct that has been brought to us by successive governments post-independence. But, as I said earlier, there was so much of connection between different revolutionary movements in different parts of India. And that too at a time when there was no, WhatsApp groups and all of that to connect with people. But still there were these meetings that that used to happen. So Savarkar provided this whole intellectual corpus, a sense of strategy. What exactly is revolution? What does that lead to? What should be the goals, objectives, all of that? So 6 months of going to London, he translates Mazzini, the Italian revolutionary Mazzini's biography, into Marathi, and for 2 years thereafter, he does intense research in the British archives on the 1857, what was still then known as Sepoy Mutiny by the British, to undermine it, saying, oh, it was just a small mutiny by some sepoys whom we caught and executed. And he started coining the phrase, First War of Indian Independence. And that is why I think Amit Shah ji in one of the rallies said that but for Savarkar, this whole 1857 itself would have been erased from our public memory as some small little, incident which a few sepoys did somewhere in India. So using British documents in British library and archives, this man rewrote Indian history in such a way from an Indian perspective. And this manuscript of that book was completed there first in Marathi by him. Now the story of the publication of that book also becomes so interesting. It was the first book in the history of world literature which was banned even before it was published. Now the British, right from the time he was in Pune and did that bonfire, surveillance was all the time on him, and probably it remained with him till his death, both before before and after independence by the British government and the Nehru government. So surveillance was a part and parcel of his life all through. So the British surveillance and spy system at Scotland Yard, they knew that this man was doing some work. So any work associated with the India House or with Savarkar and his associates were always kept under a very tight vigil. Now this manuscript that was there, in on 1857, also the Mazzini one, particularly the 1857 manuscript, it gets smuggled. Now there used to be these double barrel boxes. There's a false bottom at the bottom, and then there is a top there where there's something else that is filled up. At the bottom you have the actual manuscript. So that's how they used to wrap it in some other way to circumvent all the customs and all the surveillance and smuggle it back to India. So that's how this manuscript comes to Baba Rao. He sends it to a printing press in Sholapur. There are police raids on the manuscript. So he withdraws the manuscript, sends it back to London. From London it goes to Paris. Now Paris also, British police tell French police to conduct raids on the printing press. So the manuscript is sent back to London. From there it goes to Germany. They think, in Germany there's a lot of Indology work that is going on, and so they know the Devanagari script. So the Marathi that was written can be printed, but that doesn't happen. They make a mess. So it's again withdrawn. It goes to Belgium, and there it is printed. Then VVS Iyer translates this into English, and then this book comes to India. Now, and it creates, so the Viceroy itself and even Churchill writes, that at any cost this book should not come to India. They put the Sea Customs Act and all of that, which just shows, all through the British had categorized him as a D category or a dangerous criminal. So they were so scared of the kind of work that he was doing. A man who probably never wielded the gun himself, but the pen is so much mightier than the sword. So his thoughts and his revolutionary ideas were so scary for the British that they always were a lot of scare about this man. So this book comes to India, and then of course it creates a big furor. But what is more important is almost 20 years, 30 years after it was published initially in 1909, it still remained as an inspiration for the revolutionary movement in India. Now, in the 1920s, when Bhagat Singh and Sukhdev and others were building the HSRA, the Hindustan Socialist Republican Army, there are documented evidences, which I've also included in my book, about how Sukhdev and Bhagat Singh would actually ask new appointees to the revolutionary movement, saying, have you read Savarkar's book? So that almost became like an entry criteria to enter the HSRA. Bhagat Singh got the second edition of this 1857 book actually published. So it just shows how much Bhagat Singh was influenced by the ideas of what a revolution is that Savarkar had propounded. And 20 years later, you had none less than Rash Bihari Bose, who founded the Indian National Army, and Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose, who actually print further editions of this book in Japanese, in Tamil, and several other languages. So there are even Tamil copies which are found in raids of the INA along with Jaimani Subramaniam, one of the PR agents of the INA. So it just shows the intellectual corpus that he established then remained as a permanent inspiration to the freedom movement all through. Now, along with this, what did Savarkar do was also he inspired several of his associates, Senapati Bapat in particular, to go along with Hemchandra Das Kanungo of the Anushilan Samiti. Once again, you see, the way these people worked together, Maharashtra and Bengal, they went all the way to look for bomb manuals. That time there was these arms acts in India, so Indians could not own arms or have arms and ammunition. So you had to smuggle again bombs, pistols, and also the art of making bombs. So these guys go all the way to Russia, to France, to different places. They smuggle bomb manuals, how to manufacture bombs. Savarkar himself, most of the time in India House, he used to be in the backyard. There would be a laboratory of sorts where they were making bombs of different kinds. So these formula of how to make bombs would also be smuggled in those same false bottom boxes back to India. And in fact, he also designs the first flag of Indian independence in 1907, which is unfurled in the International Socialist Conference in Stuttgart by Madam Bhikaji Kama and Sardar Singh Rana. So once again, as I said, they were talking about total and complete freedom, and that too in an international conference where people of all countries were there, and Britain tried her best to ensure that these two Indian revolutionaries could not speak or could not unfurl the flag. So this was done at that time. Now these bombs and pistols that were brought to India went to different parts of India, and that bomb manual was the same one which was used by Prafulla Kumar Chaki, Khudiram Bose and others in the Maniktola bomb case in Alipur in Bengal. And in Nashik, you had this young man called Anant Lakshman Kanhere, who picks up this Browning pistol that is sent and assassinates Jackson, who was the AMT Jackson, who was the district magistrate of Nashik. And the British are suddenly, alarmed, saying, what is happening? Different parts of India, there are these bombs and assassinations that are going on. And with that sense of alarm, they start investigation. And first, the suspicion goes to Baba Rao. He's tried, he's unfairly tried actually, and sent away to Kalapani in the Andamans for 25 long years. And the needle of suspicion then traces back to London. There's this puny little man, with looking very nerdy and all the time indulging in research and writing. This was the intellectual kingpin of this whole movement across British India. And despite this surveillance, at that time you had Savarkar's associate, Madan Lal Dhingra, who is inspired by Savarkar to go and assassinate one of the British officials there, for which he is also hanged. And that kind of ends this whole run of the revolutionaries in London. After that, the British, in our own soil, an Indian student is able to come and assassinate one of our officials. I think that really unsettles them. So the India House is wound up and Madan Lal Dhingra is hanged. And even before he is hanged, there's a declaration of his which I have put in my book, which Savarkar gets smuggled and gets published in all the newspapers, in London. And yes, somebody is asking me about Veer Savarkar and Lenin. There is this talk, there is this information which I have mentioned in my book about Savarkar meeting Lenin. Now these are things which are very, very secretive. There are just accounts that both of them met somewhere in 1908 or 1907, but what transpired in that meeting, what happened, we really do not know. So that was the only meeting that is accounted, which I have also referred to and mentioned in my book, but we don't know what the contours of. But at any cost, he was not veered around to the Marxist viewpoint of revolution, is what is clear, despite his meeting with Lenin. So after this, he's, the India House is wound up, everybody is disperses, and Savarkar moves to Paris for a short while. But then Shyamji Krishna Verma had flown away to Paris by then. So he goes there to take shelter. But then he's very sad that, so many people are being tortured in India. My own brother has been sent to Kalapani. So why not? Why should I live a life of luxury in Paris? So he, despite several people telling him not to, he decides to come back to London. He has a lot of belief in the legal system of the British, saying, we'll fight our case and we'll see whether I may win the case and get free. So they're very confident that he will win. Now he comes to London. The very minute he alights from the train, he is captured at the station, taken to prison. There also number of cases are fought, and all the Indian revolutionaries, they help him to fight his legal case in London. Now the British were hell bent on the fact that Savarkar had to be extradited to India and tried there, because as I said earlier, the sedition laws in Britain were not as severe as they were in India, so he would not have got a very severe punishment had he been tried in London. So they wanted to ensure that at any cost, this D category or dangerous criminal that we mentioned, he needs to be shunted out of Britain, out of even mainland India, and so he had to be sent away to India. So they fight this case, lot of legalities, all those papers I have anyway included in my book. Those interested can look into that. He loses the case and he's sent back to India, extradited on such flimsy grounds that he's actually called a Fugitive and Offenders Act that is imposed on him. He was not a fugitive. He was a bona fide student who had gone there to study under a scholarship. So that itself was not applicable on someone who's gone there as a student. So he is sent back to India, and on the way, in the when he's going in the ship, even there is so much surveillance. Two guards, Indian guards of the British government, they're all the time keeping watch over him. Two British officers are all the time in the same cabin. Even if he's going to the toilet, he cannot close the door. Everybody is watching. So that kind of surveillance and fear they had of this man. Now, despite that, when the ship docks for a few minutes, a few hours in the morning at this French port of Marseille in France, he opens the porthole of the lavatory where he goes in the morning, and then jumps out into the sea and swims a few kilometers and reaches French territory. And that becomes an episode in international history, politics, geopolitics again, just as what we are facing between India and Pakistan in the Kulbhushan Jadhav case. The case goes to the International Court of Justice in Hague. Now, what is the argument there? That Savarkar says, I was a British subject, British Indian subject. Now I have now landed in on French territory. So the British have lost their right over me. So he catches a French sergeant there and take me to a magistrate, he tells them. But then that fellow does not understand English. Savarkar cannot speak French. So in this comedy of errors that happens, the British people come and they capture him and take him back to the ship. So his argument was, now I had landed on French soil, so the British have lost their right over me at that particular moment, and so the right to actually extradite me or to give me asylum is with the French government. So any refusal of that would be an attack on the sovereignty of France as a nation. So that was the construct that the revolutionaries created, and at Hague you had this whole argument. But that again shows, how important Savarkar was to the British, to the British for doing this, for ensuring that he is captured. They arm twisted France to such an extent that Savarkar should be let off to them, and he should be allowed to go and tried in India. So in fact there's huge outcry in French newspapers, because France was also the center for a lot of independent thought, revolutionaries who were all there helping the Indian revolutionaries. Yes, it is true that Irish left-wingers also came in support of Savarkar. Why Irish left-wingers, Hardikji, including Indian communists like S.A. Dange and others used to call him Comrade Savarkar. So there was a lot of good blood between people, unlike what it is now. So he loses the case in... I get a little distracted while I keep seeing the messages. I'll try to answer them as and how they come. So he loses this case at Hague, and he's extradited to India. And there also the Nashik conspiracy and the Nashik murder trial cases, two cases that are done on him. Now there also he's not given the chance of appeal. He's not even given the chance of having a lawyer, and it's a fixed match. Everybody knows what the outcome is. So he also says, I will not accept the jurisdiction of this court, and so you can do what you want. So at the end of that trial, so at the end of this trial, he's given 2 life sentences, the harshest punishment anybody has probably got in the history of our freedom struggle, which is of 2 transportations of life, accounting for 25 plus 25, 50 long years. Probably, I don't think anybody else got such a long, many were executed, of course, but a life sentence for 50 years was really harsh. He was a young man of 26, 27. So if he survived this imprisonment, he would come out 76-year-old. And so it's very, very sad. He would not even have had a family. There would be no life, all of that. So this was the punishment that was meted to him, and he was immediately packed off to Kalapani in the Andamans, in Port Blair, to rot there. And this was the year 1911. So this takes care of the first myth in about he did not even participate in the freedom struggle. So this kind of, I have elucidated all these different things which talk about what role Savarkar and also through Savarkar the revolutionary movement as such played, and we'll talk about that even as we move ahead as well. Now once we come to Andamans, briefly I'd also want to say the kind of tortures that Savarkar faced, and here comes the second myth which is often said, that he begged for mercy petitions and he cozied up to the British and secured his release. Now about that, before I get to that, a little bit about also the kind of tortures that Savarkar and several others faced at the cellular jail under this very, very demonic kind of jailer, Barry, who was there. Even the basic human facilities of good food, toilet and all of that was not provided to them. The food that was given was usually, basi khana, and in that there was pieces of reptiles and snakes and all of that. So all that, eating that, most of them would end up with diarrhea. And there was only 2 times in the day you had the permission to use the toilets. So with diarrhea, if you had to go repeatedly to the toilet, you were not allowed. And so most of these freedom fighters, so they had to defecate in their own cells, and sitting amidst your own squalor, your own excreta, to sleep, eat, sit, stand in that was, you can imagine the kind of torture it was. Savarkar himself was put to about 6-7 months of solitary confinement. Now today we can understand what solitary confinement means all the more. We are in the luxuries of our homes and with our loved ones in the lockdown, and still people are going crazy, right? Saying we can't go out, we can't meet people. Whereas here solitary confinement meant for 6 to 7 months, people, Savarkar included, were the only human contact that he had was that his cell overlooked the gallows. So every morning all you saw was people being screaming and shouting and being dragged away to be hanged. So what kind of torture would that be to shatter the human spirit of a revolutionary, you can imagine. And all day the punishment of kolhu ka bail used to be given to him and others, where he would be yoked to this oil grinding machine in the heat of Port Blair, with no water, nothing, and the whole day you had to extract about 30 pounds of oil. At the end of the day that would be measured, and if it's anything less than 30, then you would be flogged, you would not be given food for the day, and all that kind of treatment. People would have leeches and all of that, causing skin rashes, allergies. The gunny sacks that they wore as prison clothes, they would cause skin rashes, but no medical treatment would be given to them. Even in that heat and summer, just one small little bowl of water, and that took khara pani, the salty water, which would not even quench your thirst. So despite that, we see that he was, so many people, other people, Indu Bhushan Roy and others, they either committed suicide or they went insane. Ulaskar Dutt, who goes insane. There was actually a mental asylum that started at Huddo Island in Port Blair just for some of these people. So Savarkar writes in his autobiography, Maji Janma Tape, where he says there were many occasions where he also, his manobal, he's also a human being. My manobal was, my determination was hit so badly, and so he was. He also thought of committing suicide, etc. several times, but then he was reading the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, doing a lot of meditation, and in that cellular jail, with his fingernails, he would carve out poetry. Now, they were even denied the permission of pen and paper. So he was a prolific poet in Marathi right from his childhood. So he would write almost 5,000, 6,000 verses of poems, Kamla, Saptarshi and so on, which were carved on the walls of the cellular jail. And to spite him, Barry would come and whitewash the walls in front of his eyes. Now, little did Barry know that this guy had such an elephantine memory that he had memorized all those verses, and after being released from jail, these poems were actually published later. So this was the kind of torture that one faced. So in that context, we need to look at the petitions. Now, I don't call them mercy petitions at all. I call them as petitions, because this was a very legal and a normal procedure that was allowed for all political prisoners, not just Savarkar. Everybody was given the chance to file a petition. Now Savarkar was also a law student, so he knew the law. So in all his petitions, in fact in my book, in the appendix, there were about 7 or 8 petitions that he filed between 1912 and 1924. All of those I have included in toto so that you can see for yourself. Never does he say, I'm sorry for what I did or whatever. It's not an apology, but it is like, as a good lawyer was arguing, he's saying, guarantee my rights, clarify my rights first of all. Am I a common convict, who's convicted of murder, rape and all these kind of crimes, who are given these kind of extreme tortures? I'm not a criminal like them, that, we are all political prisoners who fought for freedom. We are given this kind of treatment that a murderer is given or a thief is given. Even those people, though they were given all these tortures, 6 months or so they would be given this torture, and if their conduct was good, they would be let out to go into the settlement, bring their families, etc. Whereas these political prisoners, they could not speak to their families or write letters to them once in 1.5 years. By then, in fact, in Savarkar's case, his sister-in-law Yeshu Vahini, she actually dies, and both the brother and Savarkar, who are both in the same cell, they don't even know that this lady has died. So clarify our position. Are we a common convict or are we a political prisoner? If we are political prisoners, in mainland India, the British laws that are there would actually give us a lot of concessions. If your conduct is good, you're given remission, you're allowed to speak to your family, you can write letters. So give us those rights. But if we are a common convict, like you're treating the common convicts, after 6 to 8 months, you let us off, give us some concessions. So that was the gist of most of the petitions, if you see. And the other point is, he was English educated, barrister, all of that. And so most of the other prisoners, there were almost 100 plus political prisoners in the Andamans, largely from Bengal, Maharashtra, some from Tamil Nadu, Punjab. So all these were young men, 18, 19, 20 years old, who did not know English, all of this. So they all looked up to Savarkar as their leader. In fact, they used to call him Bada Babu. So he was also acting as their spokesperson and talking not just about his release, but also the release of all the others. So in fact, in the 1917 petition, if you see, he says, and there's this particular line where he says, if the government thinks that, my release would constitute an obstacle to the release of all the other prisoners, then omit my name and release the others, because that would give me as much happiness as my own release would actually do. So this also clearly shows that he was talking on behalf of everybody. Now, what about the British? Now, after getting to Andamans, Savarkar and his elder brother were actually, they were talk about how they were also trying to do some bomb manufacture in Port Blair, and this alarmed the British. Then there was a wireless system that was devised to communicate and so on. So the British sent their Home Department member Reginald Craddock, who comes all the way to Port Blair to interview these people. He has a lengthy interview with Savarkar, and in his official report he says, I interviewed Savarkar, I met him, I spoke to him, but he is not at all apologetic or repentant about what he did. So there are British records itself which say that, and his own petitions which say that. So I don't know where this apology or repentance story actually comes from. Now, another important point, Sachindranath Sanyal, this famous revolutionary, who in his autobiography Mera Bandi Jeevan, in Hindi, he writes that I had, on the advice of Savarkar, and Savarkar used to advise everybody, others also, to write petitions. It's not only that he wrote petitions, everybody used to do that. So Sanyal also writes a petition, and Sanyal writes in his book that, I was advised by Savarkar to send in this petition, the same kind of language, the same petition as he did, but I was released, but the Savarkar brothers were not released. And the reason also, he says, that the government was so scared of these two brothers, and they felt that any release of these two brothers would rekindle the extinguished flame of revolutionary movement in the Bombay presidency. So this is what his cohorts also talk about. Now, there is one question about Trilokyanath Chatterjee. Yes, there is this talk that always comes that he never participated, he used to incite other people to do it. I don't think that is true at all. If you see the jail ticket of Savarkar, all through throughout the imprisonment, you have these, especially during Barry's regime in cellular jail, how many whiplashes he was given, how many months he was put under solitary confinement, how he did this non-cooperation of not wanting to eat. All of that is there. So it's not fair to say that he did not participate and it was all left to the others to do, etc. Now, later on he says, even in Maji Janma tape, that for first 5 years, these people who were the seniors in the jail, they did all the thing. Now, after that happened, towards the second half, he said, now it's also up to the other people who have come in. They also need to take the, struggle forward. We cannot always be fighting for everybody. Everybody should do it together. So, so I don't know what that whole, this one is, but that is bandied all the time, I know, against him. Now, interestingly, in 1920, Savarkar's younger brother Narayan Rao, who was all the time talking for the release of both his brothers, Ganesh and Vinayak, he approaches Mahatma Gandhi, who has become a great personality by then in the Indian political scene. He approaches him saying, both my brothers are, rotting at cellular jail. Can you help in some way? So Gandhi himself asks Narayan Rao that ask your brothers to file a petition, and I also will file a petition on their behalf. So Gandhi files a petition on their behalf, which again I have included in my book, where he says, they are brave people, they have suffered a lot. Now they are planning to come to the constitutional reform process. So if you remember, by 1919, you had the Montagu-Chelmsford reforms. So the British government were inching closer and closer to constitutional reforms. So Congress itself was willing to participate with the British in this constitutional reform process. In fact, Gandhi even supported the British war efforts in the First World War, and he would recruit people, soldiers for the First World War. So there was that level of cooperation without all the acrimony between the British and the Indian nationalists. So he says these two also would like to come and talk to them to join the. Thank you, Arjun Kadian. I'm very glad to know that you are a big fan. So, we would also like to join the constitutional reform process, and so they should be released. So that was Gandhiji himself. So if petitioning was such a bad word, then Gandhi himself had put in a petition. So I think all these arguments, when one puts together, it becomes clear that this whole bogey of mercy petition, of that he begged the British for release, it falls flat. And strategically also, if we see, it becomes, like what Shivaji did with Aurangzeb. I mean, he sent all these letters saying, I will be your obedient slave and all that. And based on that, he got released and later did what he did against Aurangzeb. So one could argue that being somebody who was so inspired by Maratha history and all that, this was also a tactic that he was employing through those pages of history. Now, in those 10 years, 12 years that he was there, in the interwar years, the First World War years, what is important, all those revolutionary friends of his who were in Europe, they were not sitting quiet. So they were approaching Virendranath Chattopadhyay particularly, he had, and Lala Hardayal. So they had gone to different parts of Europe, and Lala Hardayal had gone all the way to San Francisco and started the Ghadar party. So all of these people were collaborating with the Germans to ensure that, the Germans attack India, both through the sea route as well as the land route, Persia, Afghanistan, that side, and through the sea. And the sea route, there is documented, again I have mentioned these in my book in a lot of detail, where 1918, 1919, all these years you had German warships that were attacking the Indian coastline, right from Madras to even Port Blair, and a lot of intercepting that was done of these documents. It showed, and of people, the British got hang of this whole thing. There was this MDEM warship that attacked India. So the idea was to overrun India, attack Port Blair, get all these political prisoners, particularly Savarkar, out of jail, take them all the way, go to Burma, Singapore, and then raid India from the northeast. So that was the plan, which unfortunately got foiled because British got to know about it. So in those documents, to when those people who were caught were interrogated, the top of the list, the people who were to be tried, who were to be released, helped to escape, were the Savarkar brothers. So this shows that even after he came to Port Blair, as I said, one is of course the fact that they were trying these bomb manufacture in Port Blair. They were also interacting with revolutionaries. How this was being done, one just doesn't know, and we wouldn't even know because these are all secret things. So they were actually corresponding all the way between Port Blair and outside India too, which even Savarkar cannot and does not mention in his autobiography. But there were these correspondences that were going on between people. But all of that unfortunately comes to a halt, and Germany is defeated in the First World War, and with that also ends the whole inspiration of the revolutionaries who had under Mahendra Pratap and other people. They had set up embassies of free India in different parts of the world, including in Germany, in Japan and other places. So there was so much of momentum that was there for Indian liberation at that particular time. So that is the second part of the whole story. So all through those 12 years, right? I mean, along with Savarkar, as I said, there were hundreds of prisoners. Now, different people were given different time spans of prison movement, prison time, but then depending on their conduct, etc., not everybody spent 25 years or 10 years or 11 years. They were let out, and over regular intervals, before the World War, after the World War, just to gain the goodwill of the colonies, not only in India but across the world, the British started releasing people. There was a royal proclamation of Emperor George V, under which several people were released. So many people were being released, but the Savarkar brothers were the only ones who were not being released. Finally, after lot of movements that were done in the Legislative Council in Bombay and so on, many people who lobbied for this cause, in 1924 he is finally released from prison under two conditions. One is that he abstains from all kinds of politics for a period of 5 years. The second condition that was put was that he has to be confined to the Ratnagiri district in Maharashtra, and to move anywhere outside that, he has to take British permission. So under these two conditions, he is released from prison. So, and most of the others also, as I said, Sachindranath Sanyal also gave this commitment that I'll never participate in politics. But then he went and formed he was the source of inspiration for the Kakori case and also to the formation of the HSRA. So most people just gave these commitments, but they did what they wanted after getting out of prison. So now we'll come to the third myth, the third allegation that is usually heard, which is, he became a stooge of the British. He was given this pension of 60 rupees per month. Now that also, I don't know how depraved one can be to actually say this, because not only Savarkar, it was a British policy then to give a monthly allowance to all the revolutionaries, some amount, 40, 50, 60 rupees, depending on, their status, their age, all of that. So it was not as if this man got a special allowance from the British or anything. So it was a allowance that was given to all revolutionaries. And why was this given? Now, in Ferguson College, as I said, he got his BA and he got his law degree from London. Now, while he was in prison, he gets to know that all his degrees have been withdrawn. So on paper, Vinayak Damodar Savarkar today is just a metric pass, despite being a meritorious student in all these places. So where would this person go and get a job for himself? He had a wife, Yamuna Bai. After coming out, he had children. So where would they all survive? And while he was arrested, and he and Ganesh Damodar were arrested, their entire family property was confiscated by the British. Even utensils from the house were taken away. So even in jail, the only copy that was given to him, he said, this is my prime property, which is my Bhagavad Gita. That also the government wants to take away. They can take that away as well. So money, property, they came from a zamindar family in Bhagur. So there was no ancestral property taken away. Your educational title, your degrees are taken away from you. He writes several times, can I at least practice law now, etc. So that is not allowed. So how are you going to sustain yourself? So of course several people contributed, and they gave a Savarkar purse also after he gets released in Ratnagiri. So he starts writing for several newspapers as a journalist and slowly starts improving his financial condition. But till then, Narayan Rao, the younger brother, who is a doctor in Bombay, the poor fellow, sustains the family of both his elder brothers, because both of them are jobless and both of them have no money. So under this circumstance was what he got this 60 rupees of pension. So that didn't mean that he had sold out or he had become a British stooge. And as I said, it was given to almost all the other revolutionaries of the time too, and there are documents around that. Now, and if he had actually become a stooge, as people allege, then, as I said, the initial conditions of his release was for 5 years. Now that gets extended to a period of 13 long years. So why would someone actually extend the period to 13 years of somebody who was on your side? Right? So they would have immediately collaborated with you, they would have helped you, and so on, right? So the very fact that the British did not trust him, after the end of every period of this whole period of 5 years, he sends a letter saying now my term is getting over, so can these restrictions be taken away from me? They say no, we extend it for 2 more years. It is against public tranquility. The Viceroy has considered it. Your release is against public order, so we will extend it for 2 years, 2 years, 2 years. So from 5 years, that gets extended to 13 long years. So that itself shows that the British did not trust him right till the end. So the whole argument that he was actually a collaborator and a stooge and all of that, that also has very little meaning, because if he had become that, he would have been the prized person in the British books, isn't it? So that also kind of demolishes this myth. So the other thing that usually, and that's the silliest kind of argument which again people make, is he was a casteist, and Manuvadi and all these type of things, which is actually very, very sad for somebody like Savarkar, given the kind of reforms that he undertook in Ratnagiri. Now see, as I said, he could not participate in politics. So what was left to do? He said, so this Jekyll and Hyde kind of business, to show people you are just a social reformer. But on the background, they were all the time helping and collaborating with the revolutionaries. They were meeting different people. Baba Rao in particular, who had moved to Bombay. He had a house in Khar, and in that house too, there were several people, including Durga Bhabhi and others. Chandrasekhar Azad had met him in Banaras just I think a day before he was actually killed by the British, and they had a long discussion for several hours. What happens there, one doesn't know. Again, these are details we'll never get to know, because these are secret meetings. Then Durga Bhabhi, in the Lamington shooting case in Bombay, she's supposed to have left her child, her son, also in Baba Rao's house before going in the night in a car. The first time a woman actually wields a gun and shoots at the British police official in Bombay, for which they are actually caught. So the Savarkar brothers were constantly also helping them, and as I said, inspirationally also his books and works were actually helping people, so the revolutionaries. But on the frontal side, you are showing yourself as a social reformer, which in all true earnest also he was doing. And the reason for that I will come in my next point also, which is about Hindutva, which is what were among his writings of this time, what is most important is he speaks about the 7 shackles that hold Hindu society together, and they are Vedokta Bandi, which is, the Vedas are not the preserve of one particular community, the Brahmins or anybody, but it is universal knowledge. So it has to be democratized, it has to be made available for everybody. And so that is one reason he actually got the Yajnopavit ceremony done to everyone, saying, all of you learn the Gayatri Mantra, all of you read the Vedas from today. Now, of course, one could argue, if he was anti-caste, why did he perpetuate this whole caste system with the Yajnopavit? Now, you could destroy the so-called Brahminism, the hegemony, either by, like what Periyar did, of going and cutting off the Janeus of people in Tamil Nadu, or you give it to everybody so that everybody has it, everybody has access. This is a more constructive approach where everybody has access to what is knowledge, in that destructiveness of going and cutting off the Janeus, demolishing idols and all that, not much is achieved. Whereas here, if you democratize it and make everybody read the Vedas, read the Sanskrit literature that we have, our Shastras, then everybody is also benefited. So that was Vedokta Bandi. The second Bandi that he spoke about was Vyavasaya Bandi. So where the whole idea that generation to generation, it's only through birth that a vyavasaya or profession happens. He was firmly against it, and he said merit is the most important criterion for any profession. Sparsha Bandi, untouchability, he was rabidly against the whole idea of untouchability. Samudra Bandi, where he says, if you cross the seas, then you will lose your caste and all that. He was against that. He himself had gone across. So in fact, his book also is Shatruncha Shibirat. Go inside the enemy camp, understand their strategy, and defeat them in their own game. Much like what we did at Balakot. So this whole idea of Samudra Bandi also was something that he was against. Shuddhi Bandi, where in cellular jail he used to see that a lot of these Muslim warders, Jamadars who were there, they would just, the kind of tortures that I mentioned, just to get rid of that, they would just be given some beef or something and then converted into Islam. And Savarkar always said, if you convert by conviction, I have nothing against it. But if it is conversion by force or allurement, then I am completely against it. Now, once a person converts, to get back to it, because Hinduism is not a proselytizing religion. So what happens to these people who want to come back? Ghar Vapsi, who want to come back, what happens to these people? So in such cases, the Orthodox Hindus themselves were so much against their coming back to their religion. So Arya Samaj and Swami Dayanand Saraswati had started this whole Shuddhi movement. So he started that Shuddhi movement even in the cellular jail, and he said we should fight against this opposition to Shuddhi. So that also. Then Roti Bandi, which is I will not eat with people of other castes. Forget other castes. This was a time where among the Brahmins, a Deshastha would not eat with a Chitpavan would not eat with someone else, and even among the lower castes, which also was very important what he said. Usually untouchability, when we talk about, we always talk about the upper caste versus the lower caste, that all the upper castes were oppressive and all the lower against the lower caste, which was certainly there. But Savarkar's treatise was that even among the lower castes, there are hierarchies. So the Bhangis, who were the scavengers, the lowest of the hierarchy in Maharashtra, they would be oppressed by the Mahars, who would be oppressed by the the Marathas, and then the Brahmins and so on. So there was a hierarchy of sorts. So he said we should get rid of all these hierarchies and not just talk about Brahmin versus non-Brahmin, which is what is the usual narrative that we kind of keep hearing. In fact, even to Dr. Ambedkar, he says that this is something that because Ambedkar belonged to the Mahar caste, he said you should begin this campaign within the Mahars itself, that the Mahar should go and enter a Bhangi temple or sit and eat with them. So this whole idea of intercaste dining was something he propounded. And lastly, Beti Bandi, that is intercaste marriage. So Vedokta Bandi, Vyavasaya Bandi, Sparsha Bandi, Samudra Bandi, Shuddhi Bandi, Roti Bandi and Beti Bandi, the 7 shackles. So this became the theoretical construct under which he was working in Ratnagiri, where a Hindu Mahasabha, Ratnagiri Hindu Mahasabha was formed, and a lot of money was put into it to kind of convince the untouchables to come out of their Maharvadas, to come out of their ghettos. An untouchable Ganapati was installed, where the Brahmins and the untouchables together celebrate Ganeshotsavs. He and his associates would go and sweep the streets in the Maharvada and make them, tell them about sanitation, Swachh Bharat Abhiyan, so to say. So all this was being done to. And he writes again that these cannot be a top-down approach. Someone tells you, forces you to do this. This has to come from within the community. And so that inspiration needs to come from them. So through his speeches, through his own example, he would do that often. Untouchables to be allowed in schools, where untouchable children would be made to sit outside, and the teacher would not even, even if you have to admonish the kid, they will throw a ruler or a chalk piece at them. So he would time and time again insist that schools should have everyone sitting together in the temple of Saraswati. There cannot be no distinction between children of different communities. So all these kind of activities that he did in Ratnagiri in those 13 years that he was there. He started an inter-dining cafe in Ratnagiri, supported the temple entry movement in different parts of Maharashtra, but that did not work in several places, including the Rama temple in Nashik. But then to circumvent that, he says, we will start a new temple where members of all castes and communities can gather. And that's how in 1931, with the money that was given by Bhagoji Sheth, a businessman, this Patit Pavan Mandir comes up in Ratnagiri, where everyone from all castes are able to enter. And it's a very, very, touching moment where, while all these people are walking up the stairs of that temple, singing abhangs and so on, which Savarkar had composed many poems, for this occasion. All that they're singing and chanting, and tears in everyone's eyes. They are breaking those shackles of untouchability. So for such a person, so when we say Manuvadi and casteist and so on, I think that, as I said right at the beginning, that becomes the most foolish accusation that anybody can put against him. So this talks about the 13 long years. In brief, I will not be able to talk more in the interest of time that we have, but in these 13 years, the monumental reforms that were done, in Ratnagiri is something even Ambedkar, writes to Savarkar during this time. The two never met at that time, which is, I don't know why Ambedkar, though Savarkar kept inviting him several times to Ratnagiri, come and see the social experiments that we have done ourselves, but somehow Ambedkar never makes it there. But then he writes several laudatory letters where he says, that you are the only one who has understood the fact that the Varnashram system, has to be dismantled completely. Only then this whole Jativad will go away. And why he said that was also because, Gandhi at that time, if you see his writings, Gandhi was somebody who was actually saying the Varnashram system is something that is integral to the Hindu philosophy. And if you remove Varnashram system, then Hinduism, the edifice, will collapse. And I believe in Gandhi used to say, I believe in the caste system. I believe that every person cannot become a viceroy or a prime minister. So it's only those with special talents. Vyavasay Bandi ka bilkul opposite. Only generation to generation, those who have leadership in their dynastic blood, only they can become viceroys and prime ministers. So this was what was also the bone of contention. In fact, in my forthcoming book, I'm actually culling out the ideological divisions between Gandhi, Ambedkar and Savarkar, especially on this very touchy issue of caste, and how, while Gandhi was a reformist who was just looking at patchwork reforms of the society, both Ambedkar and Savarkar were probably nihilists who were trying to demolish the entire system, break the Varnashram system, because that is what gave 4 Varnas giving birth to thousands of Jatis. And so how can the Jativad go if the source of that is not gone? That was the whole idea. So that was the philosophy behind Savarkar, which even Ambedkar actually, was very appreciative of, though, as I said, the two of them never met. Now, it was during this time that he was also given this title Veer. I saw somewhere somebody asking me that question in a public meeting in Nashik, I think, in 1925 or so, after he comes out of jail. Veer Vaman Rao Joshi, who was with him in the cellular jail, he gives him this title of Veer. So there is also this whole talk that, he gave himself the title Veer and all that, which is not correct at all. There is also this whole talk about this life of barrister Savarkar, which was written by somebody called Chitragupta. We don't know who this Chitragupta is. It's a big mystery. And many people... So, there are several allusions. It was published first in Madras, in 1926 or something. And so there were a lot of allusions that probably Rajagopalachari was the author of this book. One doesn't know who is the author. It's after Savarkar was dead, I think in the much later edition, there is a prologue which says actually the author was actually Savarkar himself. So by then that man is not even there to defend himself. So at that point, this whole thing comes up. So one is really not sure even to this day as to who the author of that book, Life of Barrister Savarkar, is. So certainly one cannot say one way or the other that it was he who wrote it, because there is also this talk, why did it get published in Madras, and what is this whole connection with Rajaji, who was in fact a soft Hindutva kind of a leader even within the Congress party. So in such a circumstance, this whole idea that he gave himself the title Veer, that he was praising himself, I think that is a little weird, because I'll tell you why. Because even in Maji Janma tape, he talks about this whole episode that I told about how he swam in the ocean and all that. So Savarkar is so honest and self-disparaging that he says there was this myth about me among the people, warders and jailers and all those, that there is this brave man who swam for thousands of kilometers for several days in the ocean and came to French soil, and such a brave character. So Savarkar would go and tell them, no, it was not thousands of kilometers, it was hardly a few yards, and it took me 10-15 minutes to swim. And he himself says all their image of me as a brave hero just demolished, but I have to tell them the truth. It's not correct that I just amplify my greatness for no reason. So he says that in his book itself. So he could have made this myth, right, that I swam for thousands of days. Who would really know about this? So the fact that in his own autobiography he tells the truth about what happens about his swimming escapade in Marseille in France, that itself shows that I don't think he was the kind who would prop himself up as a great hero where it was not necessary to. The next myth that comes about is this whole idea that he was a communal person and he was divisive and all of that, and this is brought about in the context of his propounding the Hindutva philosophy. So that also very briefly, I think one must understand how this Hindutva philosophy actually came to being. So it came to being in 1923 when Savarkar was jailed in Ratnagiri, and sitting in the jail he writes this very slim book about 80 pages called Essentials of Hindutva, Who is a Hindu, and what was the driving feature behind that treatise. Now, at that time, there was a very, very dangerous movement that was going on across India. And I always keep saying that the first time if religion entered politics in India, and in a very, very pernicious and dangerous way, it was this time. And it also sowed the seeds of partition and separatism in India. And that was the Khilafat agitation that was being done. Now, what was this Khilafat movement? Now, Turkey was fighting against Britain in the First World War. Now, Turkey was ruled by this caliph, the Sultan, who was considered as a sacred, entity by some sections of the Muslims, because he was a direct descendant or so of the Holy Prophet. So, now the people of Turkey themselves did not care much for this caliph person, and in fact they wanted him out because he was an oppressive ruler. And you had Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, who comes to Turkey after the war in a democratic system of government. But then you had Gandhiji, who starts this Khilafat movement, assuring the Muslims of India, saying that we will all get together and agitate to get the caliph in Turkey, thousands of kilometers away, back on his throne. And in return, you please participate with us in our non-cooperation movement. Now, Gandhi's intentions behind this may be different, because till then the Muslim community as a whole, barring 3 to 5% of them, very few people actually participated in the freedom struggle or in the Congress movement. Right from Sir Syed Ahmad Khan's declaration that we need to be pro-British, because after the 1857 revolt, where a lot of Muslims were seen with suspicion, the community wanted to build bridges with the British and also with English education. So they were certainly of the view that we don't want to participate with the Congress. Very few leaders you had. So Gandhi's idea was give them this bait of a religious and an emotional issue, then they will come. It is a barter system. You participate in, we will help you in Khilafat, you help us in non-cooperation. Together we will achieve two objectives. One is, within 1 year, we will establish the Khilafat in Turkey. Second, within 1 year, the whole of India will get Swaraj. And this, we are talking about 1918, 1920, that era. Now, obviously, you know, this is doomed for failure, because India was a slave country. Now, if a bunch of people here are raising black flags and shouting on the streets, why will Britain want to restore a Khilafat which was actually won by them in a country which was won by them in war? They are not obliged to listen to some protesters on the street. So it was doomed for failure. It had no logic at all in it. And moreover, this promise that, you know, we will get you this one in 1 year, this Khilafat. Now, many people who are a part of the Congress, like Swami Shraddhanand, you know, he talks about, and I mentioned that also in my book, where the Muhammad Ali and others, Shaukat Ali, who were part of this Khilafat, on Congress platforms with Gandhiji sitting right next to him, they were talking about violence, about jihad, about kafirs and all of that. And Swami Shraddhanand is alarmed, saying, what is happening? He's inciting violence in the name of religion, and you're sitting quiet. And Gandhiji says, no, 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 it's all, you know, it's against the British. They are not talking about Hindus or about us. So it's about the British, so let it be. So he's quite shocked and alarmed by this theory. Now, the side effects of that, now this, as I said, this was doomed for failure, so it could not materialize. Now the Congress people, the Hindus, others, that you didn't get Swarajya in 1 year, they were not disheartened. They said, chalo theek hai, we will continue with our agitation and all that. But a sizable amount of, you know, the radicals among the Muslim community who were incited by this, they went berserk, because, you know, when you mobilize people on religious grounds, when that doesn't happen, then even the leader of the mob cannot control the mob. It just goes out of hand. And that's what happened all through the 1920s, starting with the Mopla carnage in Kerala, where thousands of Hindu Nayars, women, children, men were butchered, women were raped, pregnant women were slit open. All of this happening in broad daylight in Kerala by the Moplas, the group of fanatic Muslims there. And a few years, and different parts of India too. You know, there were communal riots in Kohat, in Panipat, in Delhi, in Calcutta, Bengal, all parts of India. And so who was responsible for this loss of life? Who was responsible for instigating people on communal lines and letting the devil out, so to say, to go berserk? So that also is very important. Nobody answers that. Now, in response, and in 1926, you know, you had Swami Shraddhanand himself, whom I mentioned earlier. He was murdered by a Muslim fanatic called Abdul Rashid, who comes into his house and kills him in Delhi. And when because he was largely involved in this Shuddhi movement, so naturally there was a lot of angst against him. So, you know, the response of the Congress, and particularly of Mahatma Gandhi, to a lot of these communal incidents was, I'm sorry, something happened. I'm back. So the response of Mahatma Gandhi and the Congress was very, very lame to most of these communal incidents. The Mopla carnage, when it happens, he says these are the brave Moplas who are fighting for the cause of their religion. And when Swami Shraddhanand is murdered, he calls Abdul Rashid, my dear brother Abdul Rashid, who is, I do not consider him as the assassin, and all kinds of things like that, which enrages several people within the Congress, several Hindus. Now, in such a circumstance, there was a need for somebody to put out an intellectual counter, an intellectual response to this whole idea of appeasement from the Hindu viewpoint, and that's exactly what Savarkar did through his treatise Essentials of Hindutva, which he wrote in Ratnagiri prison. Now, there was no need to write it in such tearing hurry, sitting in prison, and that too he wrote it in English, whereas all his other books were in Marathi, which itself shows that he was planning this book for a pan-India readership. So in that, he defines No, in the context of Khilafat, where there is extra geographical, extra territorial sovereignty being spoken about in Turkey and all that. So he says, who is a Hindu? And right at the beginning, he clarifies that I am not talking about the religion, the theological constructs of Hinduism, but then the cultural and national identity of an Indian, which is what would constitute being a Hindu. And that's where he brings out this this shlok in Sanskrit, asindhu sindhu paryanta yasya bharata bhumika pitrubhu punyabhuschaiva hinduritis savai hinduritis smritah. So anybody who lives in this landmass from the Indus to the ocean and who considers this land as his pitrubhu, or land of his ancestors, and Punyabhu, or holy land, will be a Hindu, not by religion but by his or her cultural and his their nationalistic identity. Now here also people say, oh, Pitrubhu means fatherland, Pitrubhu, so that would mean actually he was Nazi, and so all kinds of nonsense is bandied. So Pitru doesn't mean father, Pitru is actually our ancestors, right, whom we propitiate. So Pitrubhu is the land of our ancestors. Similarly, we have Punyabhu. He says again, it's not holy land that our temples are here and whatever, it is the land to which we owe our allegiance. That is how we call it holy. We should have our loyalty and our allegiance to this land, then we are Hindu. And he in fact says in that. So someone like Sister Nivedita, or Annie Besant, who came from other countries, this was not their Pitrubhu because they were born there. Sister Nivedita converted, but Annie Besant was not. But their contribution to India was much more, he says, than several indigenous Indians. So they can be considered as Hindu because one of the criteria at least needs to satisfy, either Pitrubhu or Punyabhu or both. So they consider this as such a big Punyabhu that even though their ancestors were not here, we will consider them as culturally and nationalistically Hindus. So and this was not a divisive ideology at all, because even in that treatise he says we are all one, from the Brahmin to the Nayar to the tribes in Malabar to in Andaman to Jain to Jangama to Sikh to everybody. We all have the same blood that is flowing in our veins right from the time of Rama, Krishna, Mahavira, Shivaji, Buddha, all of them. And so we are one. So that concept of integration or inclusiveness of us as a community, what finds, this was a theory, and the practical was what he did in Ratnagiri, where he talks about intercaste marriage, intercaste. So if we are all one, then what is wrong in marrying amongst ourselves or eating with each other and so on. So this whole idea that Hindutva was a communal or a divisive agenda, again, I think doesn't hold much water, because according to their own writings, his own writings, it is different. Now I will try to expedite the talk a little, considering a lot of time has already passed. But the last half of his life, which after 1937 he moves on to become the president of the Hindu Mahasabha from 1937 to 1942. There again, time and time again, even when the CAA debates were happening in Parliament, you had several people, particularly from the Congress, saying that he started the two-nation theory while he was the president of the Hindu Mahasabha. I think this is completely off the mark, because as I mentioned earlier, the first person to talk of two nations was Sir Syed Ahmad Khan, who was born 5 years before Savarkar, who said this about 5 years before Savarkar was even born. And in 1930, you had the famous poet Muhammad Iqbal also extolling the whole idea of Pakistan in a Muslim League conference. So this idea was already ingrained in several the Muslim leadership to a large extent. So if you see this book called Hindu Rashtra Darshan, which is a compilation of all the speeches and resolutions that the Hindu Mahasabha passed when Savarkar was the president, there is also this talk about how do we treat minorities, what will be the constitution of a free India, in which he says, my vision of a constitution of a free India is one where everybody is equal in the eyes of the law. Whether it is majority, minority, the majority will not get any extra privileges by virtue of being more in number. Similarly, the minority will not get any extra concessions because they are lesser in number. So everybody is equal in the eyes of the law. The minority, he says, in fact, the phrase he uses, they need not even have a ghost of suspicion in their minds that the state will infringe on their rights, their cultural, linguistic or religious rights. So whatever puja vidhi you have, you do it in your house. Don't bring your religion to the street. And in public, there is no, or in politics, there is no place for religion. So, but in the confines of your home, you can do what you want. And if anybody impinges on that freedom, then the state will intervene to ensure that you get that freedom. In fact, even the donations to madrasas, to churches, and all that, and even temples, he says that donations can be given by the state. But these should be as a percentage of the tax that the community pays to the national exchequer. So very, very utilitarian, non-emotional, non-sentimental kind of a model. I pay so much tax, in return I get so much, for my community. So this extra doles being given out to different communities just because they are lesser in number, etc., we should not do. So this whole concept of equality, so this whole that he was anti somebody, etc., that I think is very, very unfair. But one must also see, the context in which he lived. And in fact, when we compare once again Ambedkar's writings, Pakistan or the Thoughts of Partition, Ambedkar is highly virulent, in his assessment of some sections of the Muslims in India. So where, we are seeing where he talks about Islam is just a corporation which only supports those who are a part of it. As long as this separatism is there, India can never be one. All this, is something that even Ambedkar talks. So a lot of other leaders of the time too had these sentiments, is what it becomes clear. So to extrapolate that into modern context and call someone anti-Muslim, we could, if one reads Ambedkar actually in his original, you would actually call him also anti-Muslim if Savarkar is anti-Muslim. So they were all reacting to the situation of the time, and that's what becomes very important to understand. Now, this two-nation theory, repeatedly, some newspaper, I forget the year now, but I think in 1940 or so, they published that Jinnah and Savarkar are two sides of the same coin. And within a few weeks, Savarkar actually puts out a clarification saying I was misquoted. I think fake news was spreading even then very well in the media. So he says that I was misquoted here, and what I tried to say was Jinnah and I are actually completely separate individuals. He talks for extra concessions, whereas I am talking of, as I mentioned earlier, equality of everybody, in front of the eyes of the law. So how can we be the same? But he says again, we are two nations. I agree that we are two nations as long as there is a section of the Muslim community which owes its allegiance to the larger Ummah or the Muslim Brotherhood. So till the time that cross-border, extraterritorial affinity is there, there will remain two nations. But once that goes, we can all integrate as one country, culturally, nationally. And in fact, time and again he says, I keep calling myself a Hindu as long as you keep calling yourself a Muslim. The day you stop that, I will also stop that, and I will be a Vishwamanav, a global citizen, because that's what the Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, the philosophy that we are brought up with, it talks about the world being one family. But till the time you will keep stressing on your separate identity, I will have to counter it with my separate identity. I cannot absolve that because it takes two to tango, and tali do haath se bachti hai. So that was the whole idea of two nation or whatever. So even as the president of Hindu Mahasabha, he was the vocal advocate of various Hindu related causes. He also did a satyagraha against the atrocities that were committed against the Hindus in Bhagnagar or Nizam's Hyderabad. And all the resolutions were against partition and opposing the creation of Pakistan, right? So that is also there. And then time and again we're also said, oh, but he opposed the Quit India movement at a time when India was on the cusp of freedom. Now, in my second book, I'm actually tracing this entire journey out. India would have actually got her freedom 20 years before, perhaps, if not for the repeated flip-flops that the Congress and particularly Gandhi brought about. Every time the civil disobedience and the non-cooperation movement went to its peak, it would be called back, right from Chauri Chaura in 1920, 21 to later, the 1930s, and even much later the Gandhi-Irwin Pact that was signed in 1931, the various deliberations that went into the roundtable conferences that were done in London. So if one actually studies that, which I've tried to do and put in my next book, which should come out next year, it becomes very, very clear that the Congress's way of agitation was, of course, creating a pan-Indian national awareness. It was creating a sense of nationhood and nationalism, etc. A lot of feelings. But was it actually helping to get freedom? So many people were opposing even the Quit India movement, because it was the flimsiest of all the movements, including the civil disobedience and non-cooperation, with not much planning that was done behind it. It was just a blind jail bharo Andolan, which not only Savarkar, many people inside the Congress, to Rajaji and others, were quite opposed to it. Nehru had so many misgivings about Gandhi's flip-flops, which we never talk about. Ambedkar never participated again in the Quit India movement, so we don't call him also a British stooge. So very few people of the political spectrum, national political spectrum, participated in that. And like I told right in the beginning, the Quit India was in 1942, and we won freedom in 1947. So what happened in those 5 years? Why did it take 5 years if that movement was such a spectacular one? The British should have immediately got scared and you told us to quit, so we will quit and run away. So that should what have happened. That did not happen, right? So it just shows that after 1945 onwards, something else was going on in this country, and that something else was the naval mutiny that I spoke about in the beginning. And here too, right in 1939, you had Rash Bihari Bose, who was sitting in Japan, a great admirer of Savarkar. He writes in a Japanese newspaper called Dai Ajia Shugi, I think in 1939, where he calls Savarkar as a rising leader of New India, and that his persona is one of sacrifice and patriotism and so on. And it is said that, it is true that Savarkar met Subhash Chandra Bose before the latter left for Japan. Again, what transpired, what happened, we will never know these details. The inspiration, again, what I mentioned right at the beginning, infiltrate the army, appeal to the patriotic sentiments of the Indians who are there in the army, and make them revolt against the British. And once the army sets up in revolt, the British will not be in a position to have their hold over India. So that's exactly what Subhash Chandra Bose and the INA also did. And in fact, if you see British records, there is more talk about the naval mutiny than in fact about Quit India in the London papers. So that showed that even Mountbatten was given this order that, come out of the wreckage of India with as much as you can salvage, because they feared that 1857 repetition would mean a mass carnage of several British officers who were here in India, and they did not want that to happen. So in fact, we know that even Clement Attlee, the British Prime Minister who comes to India after freedom, when somebody in Calcutta asks him, what actually made you sign that transfer of power to India, he was the Prime Minister then in 1947, he attributes it to the INA and to Netaji's movement. And when he asks what was Gandhi's role in this whole thing, he actually says almost negligible. Now, as I said, this is not to disparage anybody's role. As I continue to keep mentioning, it was a great role that Mahatma Gandhi played to create that sense of nationalism, to create a mass movement and that awakening among Indians. But the actual credit where it is due also needs to be given to whoever it is due. So in that, what was Savarkar's role then? Now, in all the Hindu Mahasabha declarations, he calls about militarize Hindudom, join the Hindu army. Now, there were two reasons for that. One was, of course, what Netaji also actually speaks about later, where he says all these people who were the soldiers who were coming into the Indian army, the Hindu soldiers who were coming into the Indian army on Savarkar's behest, they became the feed for the INA. So that was one. The second was the British were taking in a lot of Muslims into the army, to create this divide and rule. So Savarkar was also alarmed. He was able to see the specter of partition, and that the northwest frontiers of our country can go up in flames if so many Muslim soldiers with arms, they can attack the Hindu population. So he said to counter that you also need to have arms within yourself. So it was not with the idea that you help the British or whatever. There again, on the one hand they say he was pro-Nazi. So if he was pro-Nazi, then he would not have supported the British army, because the British were actually fighting the Nazis. So one needs to understand which side these opposing allegations are made. So his whole philosophy of militarizing Hindudom, as he used to call it, was to create that sense of valor and to protect themselves in the event of partition, in the event of independence, when a violent uprising could happen, which happened in Kashmir, where you had the tribes who overraided the northwestern frontier province just after independence, and Pak occupied Kashmir has been a part of history since then. So all this was one reason. The other was to give the source to the INA, which is what becomes the important factor. Now, several people Professor Kapil Kumar has unearthed several letters from military intelligence which talk about how soldiers themselves have come out and said, we joined the Indian National Army of Subhash Chandra Bose from the British Indian Army on Savarkar's behest. So these are letters, proofs that are slowly coming out. You see, truth can never be suppressed for long, and sunlight is the best disinfectant. So once that truth comes out, people will get to know what is what. Now, very fact that Rash Bihari Bose had said this is a rising leader of India, I'm sure there would be a lot of people who would have felt insecure, and so there had to be some way to stymie this man's political career, and the opportunity of that comes out through the Gandhi assassination. And that will be the last part of what I will speak about before I take a couple of questions. Since lack of time, I will not dwell too much on it, and moreover it is also part of my second book which is coming up. So in this also, the kind of arguments that were put forth. Now, you see, there was an entire 3-year trial, the Red Fort trials that happened. Savarkar was arrested at such an old age. The court, the judge in his supreme wisdom went through all the evidence, and Savarkar was the only one among all the accused who was actually released, acquitted for want of evidence. But still, and if the Nehru government had a lot of evidence against him, then they could have gone in for an appeal, which they did not. The case closed there. That itself showed that there was not much. But what actually clinches the case, I think, in Savarkar's favor is Nathuram Godse's own testimony, which in court, a signed affidavit, and the signed affidavit of a dying person, the dying declaration, has some amount of sanctity to it, both legal as well as moral sanctity. And this declaration, incidentally, was banned and not allowed to publish by the Congress government for almost 20 years. And much later, it was Gopal Godse, his younger brother, who gets that published. Why I Killed Gandhi. So where he, of course, documents his whole, reasons for having a anti-Gandhi stance. But what is more important is towards the end, he also says that Gandhi, I was a great admirer of Savarkar before he was such a fiery man, but from 1942 onwards, maybe because of his failing health, because of his failing health or whatever, he was not so active, and so he also became very pacifist. So he cites certain examples also. Sometime we went and I think during the Naukhali disturbance, Gandhi goes into a temple and orders the recitation of ayats from the Quran. And so Godse goes, and his friends Apte and others, they go and disrupt that meeting, and they say, can you do the same thing, go to a mosque and read shlokas from the Gita? Why is it that only we need to have this kind of a behavior? So when Savarkar hears about this, he actually admonishes Godse and says, we are at the cusp of freedom, and we should now deal with a nationalistic government, and you should not go and disrupt. Not directly, he doesn't tell him, but he makes his displeasure known. And all these different incidents, Godse tells in his testimony that I was getting disillusioned with Dr. Munje, the earlier president of the Hindu Mahasabha, Savarkar, all these people, I think they are becoming old. They no longer have that vigor of the past. So we need to chart our own course, and we need to take our own path to save the Hindu Dharma. And whatever they felt was right. Of course, it was a heinous act. Any murder is a heinous and barbaric act and should not have been done. But then he did what he did. But in his testimony too, he mentions that this whole story that is spun around, that he said Yashasvi Houn Ya and so on. He gives a gun to him in his Dadar house and says, go. And it's so Bollywood kind of this one, go be Yashasvi and come back and show me your face. So even if Savarkar actually did it, he was such a strategist, he would not have done it so openly, and in front of so many. So Godse in his testimony says this whole dialogue of Yashasvi Houn Ya is false. Savarkar had no idea about this whole conspiracy. We were doing it amongst ourselves. Also this whole thing that Gandhi's years are over, he will not live to be 100, all these things. I mean, it's an insult both to the rational thinking of Savarkar and me, if we believed in all these curses and superstitions, is what Godse himself says. So the man who has assassinated him direct point blank, he is himself saying, now he was anyway going to be hanged, so hum to doobe hain sanam saath tujhe bhi le doobenge. He could have pulled Savarkar also along, right? I mean, there was no reason for him to save him for just for the heck of it. So the very fact that in his testimony he gives this whole claim, becomes very clear that this man was not part of this whole episode. But the whole specter of Gandhi's murder, I think it hangs, the long shadow of that hangs on him after being acquitted. So at some point we should start trusting the judicial systems of our country. It is very fashionable for the so-called leftists that as long as a court case or judgment is in your favor, then we will accept it. But if it is against, then the court is biased, the judges are biased. Now that cannot work like that. So if the courts, then why didn't you go for an appeal? So if the courts in its supreme wisdom have gone through all the witnesses, all the documents, and actually acquitted someone, you cannot keep on beating that person again and again on that count and putting the albatross of that crime on that person. Of course, there was the Kapoor Commission report, which was put several years later. Now, this commission was a highly politically motivated commission that was set up. There was a debate in Parliament where Indira Gandhi's government was the pressure was put that we need to reinvestigate Gandhi's murder. The terms of reference of that commission also was nowhere to get into the role of, say, Savarkar into it or whatever. Actually, there was a lot of there was inter-party war where they wanted to put the blame on Morarji Desai, who also had the Home Department in Bombay. There were talks in the Nagarwala Commission report, etc., which probed the Gandhi murder, which said that Morarji Desai knew that Gandhi's life was under threat, and why was security not taken away, not given to him adequately. He was more secure in British India, but the minute India became independent, he was vulnerable and got killed. So all these questions were being asked. So somewhere to fix the blame within the Congress, they needed this commission report, but somehow that whole thing went tangential, and without actually calling those witnesses, Gajanan Damle and Appa Kasar, who was the bodyguard of Savarkar and others, they were crucial witnesses in the court case, but in the Kapoor Commission, they were not even invited to give their testimony. So based on all of that, just at the end, he says, Savarkar also is implicated in this, without any back check that was done as to what brought the Justice Kapoor to Jeevanlal Kapoor to come to this conclusion. There is not much detail that is given about that. And the very fact that, there was no action taken report, there was no action that was instituted by the government on that showed that it did not have much of credibility. So, but then, towards the end of his life, by now, especially he says to somebody while crossing the Red Fort, he doesn't even look at it, Savarkar, and he says, the trial and the imprisonment for a crime that I did not commit, which I had to undergo here, is more painful to me than the incarceration in cellular jail. And so that broke his spirit finally. And also personal reverses, his wife dies and so on, and after that he is so shaken, and he finally commits atmahuti, where he gives up food, water, medicine. It's not a natural death. He passes away in 1966. So and in fact, when he dies, you had none less than the Prime Minister of India, this Indira Gandhi, who brings out a statement where she eulogizes Savarkar. She says he's the very epitome of sacrifice and a byword when it comes to patriotism. His contribution in freedom struggle is a very important aspect of the annals of Indian history and all of that. Money is given to a Savarkar Memorial Fund. A film on him is also commissioned by the INB Ministry, NBFC, and all these. So if Savarkar was a coward, if Savarkar was Gandhiji's assassin, if he was a British stooge, was Indira Gandhi also, actually supporting such a person? And if so, why would she do that? So I think the present Congress men, particularly Indira Gandhi's grandson, needs to read up what his own grandmother had to say about this whole issue, and lay this ghost to rest. I think we have flogged this man enough, and I think it's been so many years after his passing away that even now, as I started right at the beginning, that to drag his name into every contemporary political issue, whether it is related or whether it is not related to him, and to malign his reputation time and again, I think that needs to stop. His contribution on so many aspects that I spoke about, from the freedom struggle to social reforms to the cause of the Hindus of this country, and to also the ultimate freedom of this country, all those need to be kept in perspective, and he deserves that recognition or respect that needs to be given. Now, whether or not he gets the Bharat Ratna or not, that I don't know. It's all it's a political football that politicians play. In fact, it was in my book launch in Mumbai, where who was then not yet the Chief Minister of Maharashtra, Shri Uddhav Thackeray, had set the cat among the pigeons when he actually said he would vouch for Bharat Ratna for Savarkar, and actually he also said that if Mani Shankar Iyer ever comes to Mumbai, we'll beat him up with slippers. And Nehru cannot be called Veer Nehru because he did not even spend 14 minutes in jail conditions like what Savarkar did, and all that he did say. Of course, contemporary politics, 6 months later, where that story rests. So I don't want to get, I'm a non-political person, I'm a historian, so I don't want to get into blaming this one or that one. So the fact is, it is immaterial whether he's Bharat Ratna or not. That way, Mahatma Gandhi is also not a Bharat Ratna. There's so many great people who have not been given the Bharat Ratna. But I think his role, if we are able to perpetuate that role, his ideology, his vision of a unified, strong, nationalistic India, an industrial, a mechanized India, an India where all castes, all communities, all religions are equal. I think that would be a greater honor for him than these upadhis and awards that are given by governments and political parties. So thank you very much. I think I have almost taken 1 hour 45 minutes. So I will now probably take some questions. I'm sure there were several other questions which I was getting distracted with while I was speaking, but if there are any specific questions, we could take them. Thank you, Sanhita ji. How do you describe the relationship of Dr. Hedgewar and RSS and his thoughts? Yes. So, yeah, this is also an interesting question. So, I will probably note some questions down. Did Ambedkar come in support of Savarkar and Godse? I don't think so. There is a little talk about that Ambedkar actually called this lawyer of Savarkar, who was Bhopatkar, and told him that the Nehru government is hell bent on putting implying Savarkar in a case. Ambedkar was a law minister then, right? So there is this talk of Ambedkar calling Bhopatkar and telling him. Now I'm yet to actually verify that information. I really do not know, but it is a part of folklore. Once probably I get some verified information, which is very tough to verify some of these things. These are secret meetings, private meetings. Maybe Bhopatkar has written something about it or somewhere. It's becomes tough. Now this Dr. Hedgewar and the RSS, I think the RSS and the Hindu Mahasabha, they shared a very different kind of, it's tough to describe that relationship between the two, because both of them were speaking to the same constituency, the Hindu community, while the RSS always abstained and still abstains from politics. Hindu Mahasabha, like the BJP, is the political arm, so to say, not of the RSS, but it was a political party, especially under Savarkar. So obviously there were some differences of opinion on several issues. Whether we need to participate in politics itself, that was the basic difference of opinion. Then a lot of Savarkar's views, which were far ahead of their times. His views on cow worship, where he said, I do not consider the cow as being sacred. If you want to worship, you worship, but cow is a useful animal. It needs to be protected. But the cow has repeatedly been used by invaders as a shield, so that the Hindus do not shoot their arrows. All of this. So use animal husbandry, etc., to increase milk production. All this through cows, but don't elevate an animal which sits in its own excreta to the status of a goddess. You become the god you worship. You will also be a docile country. So Hindutva's icon should be Narasimha and not the cow. So he had all these out of the box ideas, and all his other things which I mentioned, intercaste dining, intercaste marriage. The maximum amount of opposition I think that he faced was from Orthodox Brahmins in Ratnagiri, Orthodox Maharashtrians in Ratnagiri, much more than other religions, because they were alarmed that this Chitpavan Brahmin, who was also eating meat, prawns and all that, was somebody who was advocating this kind of earth-shattering reforms. The RSS at that time was more orthodox leadership. So there were differences of opinion among them, but nonetheless, interestingly, it was Baba Rao was among the founding members of the RSS along with Dr. Hedgewar. So in fact, Baba Rao had a Yuva Hindu Sena, which a lot of Abhinav Bharat members had got into that. He merged his organization into the RSS. So there were a lot of areas of convergence too between them, and it was not that they shared any animosity or they hated each other or anything. There were a lot of ideological small areas of differences of opinion between them, which is only but natural to have, especially when you have someone so radical as Savarkar, who talks about such far-reaching reforms far ahead of his times. So that was what it was. I think much later under Guruji Golwalkar and Savarkar, the differences became a little more pronounced for various reasons, but overall I don't think they were adversaries. And even now I think Savarkar is one of the Pratah Smaraniyas of the RSS, and the amount of work that the RSS has done to perpetuate Savarkar's memory and legacy, probably any other organization has ever done in India. So are there any other questions? Uddhav Thackeray is a great Congress leader indeed, says Shashwatji. Your comment is noted. Can't say much on that. So Mrityunjay ji, if there are no other questions that anybody has, I'll probably just hang on for a minute or two, and if something comes up in someone's mind, you could let me know. Otherwise, you could always write to me. So I'm only hoping, now that when there are so much of calumny, so many canards that are spread against this man, those who are, as I said right at the start, those who are his supporters, who are proponents, who like him, they don't even know on what basis they like him, because to be able to read the depth of the work that he did is not an easy task. It takes a lot of effort to read, digest, understand. His language is also very, very clished, so to say, the Marathi, the Hindi, all of that. So to be able to do that is tough, but I think the time has come when, based on historical facts, based on documents, based on not on sentiments and emotions, because that is how Savarkar would have wanted himself to be defended. In fact, in all his meetings too, he would say, I'd love to have more people who differ with me, which is the true mark of a liberal. Not nice to have everybody who's your yes prime minister, who agrees to what you say. So so people, and that's one reason he said, don't ever make me an idol, because once you elevate someone to the status of a god, then you cannot question that person, which is unfortunately, I think, what has happened with Mahatma Gandhi, where even an objective assessment, an impartial assessment of him or his role, his lapses, his achievements, we cannot do, because he has been elevated into this father of the nation figure, almost a holy cow, so to say. But on the other hand, Savarkar is the opposite, where every fault, whether it is actually caused by him or not, you want to beat him up with that particular, whip. So I think the time has come when a lot of young people who are listening, who are reading about him, should gather these facts and should actually come out with cogent arguments in a very calm, cool, composed manner, because, as I said earlier, truth cannot be suppressed for long, and once one has truth on your side, once you have facts and documents on your side, nothing really will matter. So you can answer all those questions, because nobody on the other side also has done too much research. It's all the same ghisapita allegations that keep coming on and off. So to demolish it is not so tough if one has all the facts and documents on your side. So I do hope that through forums like yours, this trend catches up, and to also read a lot of what he has said amongst yourself. They need not always be someone like me or anybody else who's researching on Savarkar. I also see another very important scholar who has been doing work on Savarkar, Akshay Jog ji, who is been on the broadcast. He has done some phenomenal work, particularly in Marathi, on all the allegations that are done on him. So a lot of them are writing books, writing about him. But I think amongst yourself too, it's important to have discussions on maybe aspects of his life or aspects of his political philosophy. What was his idea of Indian economy or Indian society, the social reforms. There could be discussions among yourselves where someone reads up and talks about it to the rest of the people, which was incidentally how Abhinav Bharat used to function in Nashik. So one person would take up a topic, read up everything, and discuss it with the rest of the crowd, and there would be question answers. So that trend could continue on Savarkar's writings, which could be made popular in a very simple manner, because that, I think, will be more important than worrying whether he gets Bharat Ratna or not, because it just does not matter, in my opinion. So considering that there are a lot of heart smileys that are coming up, I'm assuming that everybody has liked what they heard, and there are no more questions. I once again thank Think India and Mrityunjay ji and everybody for this opportunity. Thank you so much for patiently listening to me for close to 2 hours, but it's been an absolute pleasure, and I do hope that this kind of took off some of the allegations, the lid of the allegations on this great man. So thank you very much. Jai Hind.